Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you all enjoyed last week's live presentation where I introduced myself via my bookshelves. If you didn't get a chance to watch that, definitely check it out. I promise you that this video will not be nearly as long, but I just wanted to take a minute and talk a little bit about my past as an editor. So I graduated from Whitworth University with a creative writing degree, and I knew that I wanted to publish my books, but I wasn't quite ready to take the dive into publication yet. Thankfully, I was hired, very honored to have been hired to launch the fiction department of Fantasy Flight Games. Now, Fantasy Flight Games is now owned by Asmodee, but at that time they were their own entity, and they were looking to expand out of board games and into the novel world. What is fun about FFG is that at that time they were one of the few companies that had created their own worlds for their board games. Now, there are a lot of board games that are not story-based. They're just a game. You couldn't write a story about what takes place during Seven Wonders or Ticket to Ride. So when I was hired by FFG, they were thinking, wouldn't it be cool, since we have these worlds that we own the rights to have some books released that coincide with the board games? Now, this is reliant on the idea of an IP. IP means intellectual property. An intellectual property is owned by one entity or company, and that means that they have the exclusive rights to that world, including its characters, its flora, its fauna, everything that describes that world. Some popular examples would be Star Wars, Harry Potter, anything by Disney. All of those are owned by those companies, and you can't do anything in those worlds without their say-so. So when it came to FFG, they had 4 primary IPs that they wanted to have novels published in. One of them was Android, which is a futuristic noir detective game. It's actually incredibly fun, but you have to have a dedicated 14 hours for it. It's a very long game, but you're actually solving a mystery as a detective in this noir futuristic world. Very, very fun. The second one is Tannhauser, which was a 1940s alternate history look at World War II. It was really interesting, a little bit dark for my tastes, but that's nothing compared to the third IP, which was based on H.P. Lovecraft's stories, Arkham Horror. Because Lovecraft is in the public domain, they had been able to create an entire board game series based on the stories, based around the world of those stories, and now they wanted to publish novels also in those worlds. And then the final one was a Fireborn series. Fireborn was about a world where some people were actually dragons in disguise, and they had to unlock their potential as a dragon, and adventure ensues. So I was hired and brought in to launch the novel department. Now, to launch a novel department, you have to start at the very bottom part of the entire publication process. So the first thing was finding authors. I really enjoyed this. This was a chance to read a whole bunch of science fiction and fantasy authors, to talk to my fellow coworkers, ask them who are some authors you have always wanted to work with that you think if we pinged them and said, hey, do you want to write a story in one of these IPs, if they would be willing to do that. That was how I ended up getting to work with some incredible names. We'll get to them here in a second. So the other main part of preparing for these authors to come in was writing the story Bibles. So a story Bible is the rules of the world for each of these science fiction and fantasy worlds, which meant I had to play each of those games get really familiar with not only what was actually published, but what was in the creators' minds before they were published. So I got to work with the board game designers and talk to them about, what were you picturing? What is behind the scenes? Let me ask you some questions that I think an author would ask you if they were going to write a story based in your world. So things like, in the world of Android, how does an android actually work? Are we talking Cylons here from Battlestar Galactica, or are we talking something a little bit different? I got to learn terms like the uncanny valley, which is the belief that there is a point when creating an android or an AI creation, artificial intelligence creation, where if you get too similar to an actual person, it actually makes us feel uncomfortable and we can't handle it. I got to learn a lot of terminology and things like that. So with writing a story Bible, I got to answer all of those tough questions. And we added to the story Bible as the author started writing, of course, because they would come across other things that they would ask. Okay, what kind of sword does this character have in this world? Would this character carry a 6-shooter or a semi-automatic in Arkham Horror? That kind of thing. What was fun was each of the worlds was actually a very different genre. You have Arkham Horror, which is a mix actually of historical and horror. Because it's set in a real time period, I had to be familiar with all of H.P. Lovecraft's work, plus the board game, plus that time period, which was 1930s, 1940s. Tannhauser, same thing. It's an alternate universe. So I had to be familiar with everything that actually did happen in World War II, so that way we could twist it and say, well, but what if this happened and it changed the future? Speaking of future, Android. You might think, oh, well, if you're coming up with a futuristic universe, you can do whatever you want. Not with science fiction, especially when you're working with hard science fiction authors like William H. Keith. It was very important to him that when he was writing in this IP, he stuck to his hard science fiction guns. So I know you're probably wondering, how did I get from being a science fiction and fantasy editor to writing historical mystery? And honestly, I'm going to say the crossover point began with the very first novel that I edited and published with Fantasy Flight Games, and that was Free Fall by William H. Keith. Now you might have noticed that the endorsement that I received for Butcher Baker Candlestick Taker, my very first book, was written by William H. Keith, New York Times bestselling author, one of my dear friends that I still talk to. He's read my book and said it was a vivid and intense historical thriller featuring murder and mystery, mayhem and madness in 1901 Spokane. So I am eternally grateful to William H. Keith for giving me that blurb. And especially because it really goes back to him and his book and working with him on writing Free Fall. So Free Fall is set in the futuristic dystopian world of Android. It is our world, but, well, let me just read you the back. It is the future, and while the world has changed, crime has not. Can I just say that that is something that I have written multiple times in my historical fiction books? There is nothing new under the sun. And that's one of the beauties of science fiction and fantasy, is that even though the culture, the worldview might change, you can still examine questions about humanity. And sometimes by taking that step back, it actually allows us to ask those really, really hard questions. Now, some people choose to do it by taking a huge step back into science. Some people take a huge step back into a fantasy made-up world. Some people take a step back into history and say, wait a minute, have we really come so far from where history was taking us? It's a hard question. So Android is greatly influenced by Blade Runner. And that was the other thing that I really enjoyed while working with him, was Bill was able to incorporate lots of Easter eggs and little hidden references to all those classic noir mysteries and classic science fiction. So that is actually something that I do in my books as well. I love making quotes and incorporating little Easter eggs in my books. As an editor at FFG, I had to do all the different steps of editing. I did everything from receiving the pitch from the author. They had to include a complete outline of the book, actually. And this was because it was an IP. And so if there were going to be any errors, any problems that we were going to have with the designers of the game arguing with the author of the book, we needed to know that before the author sat down and put all this effort into writing this book. I had so much fun working with those two aspects and trying to get them to meld into the middle. So the first step in editing is actually a content edit. And we kind of took care of that with our having a story Bible, having the outline ahead of time, and then talking to the designer of the board game and making sure that our content was going to meet exactly what the designer had in mind for this world. The next step was then to do a developmental edit. Now, a developmental edit is when you're looking at the story and at the construction of the plot. Now, when you're writing a mystery, it's very, very important that you hit that fine line between making it too easy for the reader to solve the riddle of the mystery and having that wow effect of, oh my goodness, I never saw that coming, but I should have, right? That's the key. And that's something I learned from Bill Keith when he was writing Android, was he talked to me about finding that fine line. Because you really want the reader to get to the end and go, wow, so-and-so did it? I never saw that coming. But now that I think about it, all the clues were there, right? I love hearing from people who reread my books, who say, oh my goodness, Trisha, all of your clues were there and I didn't see them. How did I not figure this out? That is the best part of writing mystery. One of the best parts of writing mystery. So after content and development, now we have line editing. And that is getting more into the nitty-gritty of the actual editing process. Now, depending on who you talk to, you're going to hear different definitions of line editing versus copy editing versus proofreading. Now, when I worked at FFG, we tried to divide it into those three in that order. So it was content, development, line editing, copy editing, proofreading. And the difference is you don't want to do a proofread at the beginning when you're studying the content. If somebody comes in and starts moving commas and periods around and fixing autocorrect spelling here during the developmental edit, that whole section might be cut. You don't know, right? The author might decide to rewrite this entire chapter or cut the entire chapter, in which case that period or comma didn't really matter. So you don't want to waste your time doing that during this step of the process. You want to do it later. So you're going to end up hiring somebody else, because remember, the golden rule of editing is you can't edit your own work. Now, there are some editors who will do all three of those for you in one go. They probably will say they will do a couple reads through, and what they actually mean by that is that they are doing each of those steps separately, but they won't send it to you until they've got it done. I can go a whole thing about the editing process, and if you're interested in that, I can get into that. But right now I just want to talk about how there were all these different steps to the editing process, and I ended up doing all of them. I also ended up learning how to do the marketing, how to do the back of book, how to do the art description for the cover art, right? All of that was taught to me through my job at FFG. This is why when I look back at my job as a science fiction and fantasy editor, I cannot thank FFG enough for hiring me, even though I only had the honor of doing it for a couple years before we ended up moving to Colorado and I pursued a freelance editing time in my life, which worked out really well until I had kids. And then I had to take a break. But that's how life goes. I still learned so much in my job at FFG that it was the reason why I first did not want to self-pub did not want to do Indie Pub, did not want to do it myself because I said, nope, I've done all those steps. I know how hard it is. I know how much it costs. And I know that I don't have the time to do that. I have 2 kids at home. However, things change. Fast forward to 2019. I have an agent. I am pursuing traditional publication with that agent. I have had a short story published in a Christmas anthology, and we're currently pitching Butcher Baker Candlestick Taker to the traditional publishers out there. We tried for a good year and a half, and then 2020 hit, right? And the world changes. In 2019, my husband and I also had the honor of going to the World Science Fiction Convention in Salt Lake City. And there we met Brandon Sanderson, Dan Wells, and other incredible names, Jim Butcher, so many names that we had followed through the Writing Excuses podcast, which if you haven't listened to it, definitely listen to it, and so many other fellow authors who were pursuing publication. It was while I was there that I felt very strongly I am never going to pursue self-pub. I was reminded again of how much work they had to do in order to get their books out there, and it just seemed so much easier going the traditional route. That being said, 9 months later, the world changes in March of 2020. And suddenly, these new programs start being proposed and worked out, and things like Draft to Digital, Findaway Voices, and Ingram Spark make their appearance on the market. It's no longer just Amazon. And I can do a whole video separate about my self-pub journey. Suffice it to say, it has been so worth it to do indie publication. Let me say that again. It has been so worth it to be a part of the indie community. The indie community is where new ideas go to grow and flourish. It might be a little bit harder to get yourself out there, but here's something else that I learned while working with these New York Times bestselling authors. So here I am, 2010, getting the chance of a lifetime to work with some incredible New York Times bestselling authors, including George R.R. Martin. We worked on 2 art books together. They were art that the FFG team had acquired for their living card game based on the Song of Ice and Fire world. Absolutely incredible chance. And then I got to edit and work with creating books and publication with several New York Times bestselling authors and several authors that should be New York Times bestselling authors if they have not done so already. So let me just list those off for you. I worked with Graham McNeil, Alan Bly and John French, Mel Odom, William H. Keith, Tracy Hickman, Robert Jeshonik, who actually won the 2013 Scribe Award for Best Original Novel. So I love saying that I got to work with him on that project. I also worked with Stephen Seville, Matthew Farr, Blaine Pardoe, Jordan Ellinger, Peter J. Evans, James Swallow, and then I got to work with Stephen Seville actually a second time with his friend Stephen Lockley. Absolutely incredible. And like I said, I got to work on a variety of genres in that time as well. Here's what was interesting. Working with New York Times bestselling authors and hearing them say, if I had it to do over again, I would go indie. Why? Why, you ask? Well, it's because they said they were doing just as much work, they felt, on the traditional side as we would have to do for indie. Now, what they were talking about was going out and pushing your book, right? That in the end, it's still the author's job to sell their book, right? The company publishing it can only do so much, even if they're Random House, right? And they're providing you with a New York Times bestseller because they have all the ins everywhere, right? But in the end, There are still all these other things, scheduling all the talks, making sure that you're going around and doing a circuit and just putting your name out there, doing social media, all of that. The authors still had to do. And for many of these authors, they felt that why am I doing all this work and then not getting that much in return? Because a traditionally published author does not make that much per book. An indie published author makes a lot more per book. We're also doing all the work, so, I think we deserve that, right? But in the end, these authors are selling their work and not feeling fully compensated for that. That really stuck with me, and it came back to me in 2019. And again in 2020 when the world changed and I realized, you know what? I have the background in editing. I have the background in publication. I know the steps that are required, including making covers or finding people to make the covers for me, writing the back of book, putting myself out there, doing events, all of that. That all came from my background as an editor. So in conclusion, did my work as a science fiction and fantasy editor bring me to the point of writing historical mystery? Yes, 1,000 times yes. I think it also inspires my writing style in many ways. I don't read just mystery. I read a variety of genres, and I think that shows. People who read my books can tell that I enjoy reading and that it is a love letter to other books and other stories. And I can have a main character who is an inventor, who is working with sound theory. So in some ways, it's science fiction. So we'll see what comes further down the pipe for Archie and all the characters in the Spokane Clock Tower Mysteries. But thank you for tuning in and hearing a little bit more about how my background as a science fiction and fantasy editor brought me to the point of publication today. If you are hoping to meet me in person, I would absolutely love to do that at Cosign, which is next weekend. It is January 20th through the 22nd in Colorado Springs, right here in my hometown. My husband and I will have a booth set up where we will be selling his books as well as mine. I will be there in a steampunked version of my normal Edwardian garb. So I hope that I will see you there and we can chat more about how different genres can impact each other and that we can learn and grow together in this incredible literary community that is springing up in the world today. Thank you so much. I'll see you next week.